Good afternoon to all our listeners out there. My name is Simbrit Smith, and I am one of the co-founders of Roose's Book Club. And I'm here in the studio with
Ryan Robinson, Parent Chief. Hello, everyone. I'm the founder and director of the Future Leaders Program, which is the organization behind Roose's Book Club. And we're excited to be back here today for our second last episode of this season. How did we do in our last episode, Sam, and what's in store?
I think last episode was a heavy one, and we definitely got a lot of feedback from you all. So we want to thank you for your encouragement, for you listening in and giving us feedback in real time. So we are on episode 4 now of season 2, and we've been exploring perception and reality, and how where we are today is a reflective of the things that we have experienced throughout our past, our colonial history. And we're examining how the state that we're in right now, it's not just because we landed here willy-nilly. Like, it's been a journey of what we've lost, of how our colonial past, our colonial history has shaped us, where it's landed us today. And so we're going to continue on that journey with our episode called On Our Own Terms.
For those of you tuning in for the first time, Roose's Book Club is a sub-project of Future Leaders Bermuda, and the purpose of the book club is to explore concepts around underdevelopment, colonialism, the issues impacting Bermuda today in that context of that history. It was inspired by young Bermudians seeking a desire to obtain a better knowledge of their history and where we come from, and explore some of these issues from a critical lens. And so over the last 2 seasons, we've been exploring these topics around a curriculum of books that we've unpacked and summarized in order to have the discussion here today. So as Simbrit was mentioning, we've spent the better part of this year so far on season 2, Perception and Reality. We had a bit of a heavy episode 2 weeks ago because we were looking at the need to destroy in order to rebuild. Why don't you take us through a little bit of, Simbrit, some of the topics that we covered, the book we were on, and then I'll take us back and we'll talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today.
So we introduced our next book. It's called Black Power, The Politics of Liberation by Kwame Ture and Charles V. Hamilton. And this is a book rooted in steps for political modernization. So we ran over those 3 steps in the last episode. We talked about how we need to challenge old views. We need to come up with new ideas, new structures that keep our needs and focus as a people in mind. And then it's about being able to dream about what those new structures would actually look like and how they would materialize for us in our present day. And we really, even though Charles V. Hamilton and Kwame Ture come from an American perspective and they write heavily on the structures and the political scene of what's happening in America, we were able to Bermudianize it in a way. And so we really delved into some critiques of the leadership that we have going on, how a lot of times, not really just a lot of times, but how in today's society are not just our leaders on a political level, right? Because we really emphasize that. We're talking about leadership across the board in unions, in schools, in grassroots organizations, in community clubs, leadership at every level. In our present day, we're seeing more so of a popularity contest and placeholders instead of people who have really tried to center not only just the needs of Bermuda, but to follow these 3 steps of political modernization, right? Of making sure that we're staying present, we're critiquing, we're examining what's really working and what's not working for us here in Bermuda today. And so we're actually going to continue that discussion in today's episode, right? And we have another book that we're going to add to the discussion.
So building off of what you just mentioned, Simbrit, in our last episode, we were talking about political modernization and the 3 steps, right? And one of the poignant points that you made in the last episode was essentially we have these institutions that came out of an era of visionary leadership, right? Where we talk about our Black organizations. And they came out of a particular type of leadership, a particular era in which we had community trust. And
Yes.
the point that you had made was that essentially our Black institutions today are no longer having the same impact because the community and the trust that created those organizations has broken down, and the leadership no longer hold the weight that they once held. And so what that resulted in is that the key power drivers of the organizations that Black Bermudians and our community were able to build back in the 1960s and 70s and in those movements, those drivers no longer exist, and the leadership no longer command that respect. And so what we have are institutions and organizations, but we don't have the trust or the unity or the belief in them. And so we have these vehicles of power, but we're not able to mobilize and bring them together in order to drive our people forward, right? So shifting into today's episode is called On Our Own Terms. And so with the last episode being the need to destroy in order to rebuild, which was all about theoretically questioning the old values, the old institutions, the old leadership, building anew, and then pursuing economic and political self-determination. The purpose of this episode today is we're going to try and draw out some real examples in Bermuda's history to demonstrate where these things actually happened before. A lot of times when we talk about nation building and community building, and when we talk about whether that's Black power or anti-colonialism, these are pretty big, scary concepts, and we have a tendency for skepticism and doubt to kind of creep in, right, where we don't think these things are possible. And so today's book that we're shifting toward is Black Power in Bermuda, The Struggle for Decolonization by Keto Swan. And this is a very special book because it's written by a Bermudian author. This is a homegrown book here, and it basically goes through a lot of the history of the Black Bermuda struggle over the last century and even some of the history before, which allows us to draw some connections to today. And the relevance of this book is what we're hoping to demonstrate today is that when we, throughout Roose's Book Club, go through this journey around, the most recent topic now about political modernization and questioning old values, defining new goals, achieving that political and economic self-determination, the takeaway that we want persons to leave with today, once they get into this book and the discussions, is these things are not impossible. In fact, they actually were done before. Those institutions we talk about that have sort of stagnated, that political modernization that's needed, we had that before. These were once vibrant. We once had those goals and that hope, and we need to get it back again. And so as we get into today's episode On Our Own Terms, following the last episode about destroying and rebuilding, this is where we talk about rebuilding. Rebuilding suggests it was once built in the first place, and we're repeating that process. And so this is not something that we're exploring in a vacuum. We really want to get into some specific Bermudian examples to demonstrate that actually we've had this great leadership before. We've had this strong, trustworthy community sense before, and we can get it and build it again. And so we're looking forward to getting into today's topic, Black Power in Bermuda by Keto Swan, as we examine contemporary Black history and some of the things that we were able to do as a people to get us to the steps that we even made and the progress that we have seen today.
My favorite thing about this book is that Keto really grounds his work not only just in the historical facts and figures of the events that took place, but he really reveals the interconnectedness of both our past political leaders, the grassroots organizations, community clubs, and how their role influenced the larger, more global anti-colonialism freedom movements of the day. So we're really going to be focusing heavily on chapter 4 for those of you who are listening in and joining along and who have read this book. And it's so interesting, Rye, because if we break down our scripts, last week we really leaned into step number 1. And this week we're leaning into step number 2. but these aren't new goals and they're not new ideas. Our elders already really laid the groundwork for us. And so I hope that if there are listeners out here who are new on this journey, who haven't really delved into these books as deeply as us, or who are those who are listening and they're kind of really going along this journey for the first time, don't let the anxiety of trying to be a part of movements really overwhelm you. We've been here before. We can do it again. And it really is taking it step by step.
And this is an exciting chapter and time in Roose's Book Club and our journey, because as we mentioned when we first started Roose's Book Club, this is a bit of an educational journey. So we're tracing this through, right? And if we look at last season's episodes, which was season 1, all about foundations, we talked a little bit about how we got here as a society, some of the foundational steps that are needed, the preconditions for progress, essentially looking at some of the things that we need to have as a starting point before we even talk about building a society and a community. And in this season, we are talking about perception and reality, which is all about questioning our subconscious limitations, our beliefs and self-doubts about ourselves, and contrasting that with the reality, right? And recognizing we have biases and things that are preventing us as a people from moving forward. And so the stage that we're at now, having laid that foundation, having talked about the starting point of community trust being necessary, having recognized in theory that we need to question our old values and systems and see if they're really working for us and define new ones, the part that we're at now is really getting into the nitty gritty of it, really looking at some of these specific examples where this was done. And Keto's book really illustrates that using some of our own local, homegrown national heroes, figures that many Bermudians may recognize. And so it's really important that we acknowledge that we have gotten this right before. There's no need to start from scratch. There's no need to look overseas. We have these connections, and they're all within us, and that power is within us. So with that being said, I just want to recognize some key quotes from the previous book, Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton in Black Power, The Politics of Liberation, that kind of help to shed some light on what we're covering today. So one quote from the preface of Charles Hamilton and Kwame Ture's book was, "The definitions of ourselves, the roles we pursue, the goals we seek are our responsibility." And that's just acknowledging that it's up to us to define who we are and our future. And we know that we can't really do that without an acknowledgement of the past. Another quote is that political modernization begins with the need to question the values and institutions of the society. And I think, Sam, we've done that throughout sort of the past couple episodes and season. And the last one is power is not given. It must be built and wielded, which is chapter 3 of Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton's book on page 44. So when we talk about power not being given, it must be built and wielded. That's really kind of what a lot of this episode focuses on, as well as chapter 4 from this next book by Keto Swan.
And Rai, I'm really excited to delve into this because it's not a lot of times that, well, first of all, we've only done one local book. And we're on book number 5,
number 5 or 6 now.
Well, number 5 or 6. So this is only our second local book, but to even be able to speak to the Bermudian experience at every step of the way, because even as we move into the rest of the show, we're really going to be coming from a Bermuda's perspective. And so let's look at sort of what Bermuda got right in questioning the old. Right, because that's step 1 of political modernization. You have to question the old, and we have so many of our own examples of this. Right, so one example of even challenging and questioning the old and really pushing the envelope of what it is to take responsibility for our own and to examine what role we play on an individual level is how the BIU was formed, right? So you had Dr. E.F. Gordon, who was actually a Trinidadian who came over in the early 1900 wave of other Caribbean families and individuals coming over into Bermuda and settling here, right? And he saw a lot of the injustice, particularly within the medical field. And he formed the BIU as a way of collective power, as a collective way to give power to the people, but also to form an organization that's actually going to, again, center the things that we need, right? And so the Bermuda Industrial Union emerged to confront economic exploitation, institutional racism, and labor inequality under colonial rule.
And that's a good example. You cover on kind of two steps there, Sim, because if we talk about sort of what we're doing today, right, we're taking Charles V. Hamilton and Kwame Ture's steps to political modernization. Step 1, questioning the old. Step 2, defining the new. And step 3, pursuing economic and political self-determination. And what I think we've just spoken to, if we're starting with step 1 about questioning the old, we have leaders and a people, right, who in Bermuda were questioning and challenging the systems and the practices of that time. And so what that led to was a step 2 in that context of defining the new, right? Because out of that questioning came a movement, came an organization, came something that was able to be built and grow. And we'll come back to the union example as we go through the various steps. There's some other steps or some other examples of step 1 of questioning the old and challenging the old that go back even before E.F. Gordon and the unions, right? Let's take the example. I mean, we just celebrated National Heroes Day. Let's take the example of someone who should be a national hero, but maybe is a bit too contentious, right? Sally Bassett. Sally Bassett was an enslaved woman who got a reputation for poison plots and attempting to overthrow the colonial masters. And that's somebody from the days of enslavement who really exemplified a challenge to the status quo. Back in that time, there were various different perspectives on slavery, various perspectives on how to confront slavery. And Sally Bassett was one of those early leaders who I have no doubt, if she were around, in the modern era, would have been one of those leaders or visionaries or mobilizers like the Black Berets and all the rest, right? And so when we look at her example, it sort of reflects that very early, and the many other uprisings and the enslaved persons who had no name that we're aware of, right, or who weren't featured in the history books or who will never get that national hero status for various reasons. We have a long legacy and a history of questioning and challenging what's in place.
And one of my favorite part, specifically when it comes to Sally Bassett, is tying in your quote, right, that power isn't given, it must be built, it must be wielded. It's more than just not waiting for permission to be able to take back power, but it's also about being bold enough to stand in who we are as a people. And another perspective that's going to come into this book time and time again is how Bermudians influenced global movements, right? And so with Sally Bassett's story, her account or her story of her poison plots actually spread throughout the Caribbean, and it influenced other poison plots in other Caribbean islands. And you're going to see the same thing as we delve into Black Power in Bermuda. Small island, big energy. And so what we do here matters, and it's like, if we can stand in who we are, and if we can be able to wield that power, if we can be able to build it, it's not just about us for us here in Bermuda. It spreads, it influences, it causes a butterfly effect, a ripple effect throughout other regions and generations in the world. And again, it's back to the interconnectedness that Keto brings to his book, because he talks about the relationships not just between leaders and organizations and the people. It's also about Bermuda and its contacts in the wider world. And I love that because we often struggle with where we fit into the global scheme of things. And we're going to keep reiterating it throughout the show. we've already done this.
Yeah, and we like to cling on to Bermuda being another world and we're unique and the things here don't apply elsewhere. But the reality is we're more connected than we think. We have more influence and impact than we know. And I use the word know because a lot of this is intentionally not taught. Right? A lot of it is intentional in our belief that we are so separate, so isolated, so special that we can't possibly do things that influence others or be influenced by others and have that interconnectedness, right? And I think, like you said, Simbrit, the story of Sally Bassett is a classic example of even back then in the days of no internet, right? And no social media and no Twitter and TikTok, Sally Bassett's impact and influence resonated across the Caribbean and contributed to other uprisings. There was some sort of connection there and some sort of collaboration and inspiration that really drew us to our Caribbean and even African American brothers and sisters, right? There's another piece to the story of Sally Bassett, which is also relevant since we're applying theory here in our various readings, right? And that's the betrayal of Sally Bassett. And that's just a small side note, but I want to touch on it because if we go back to episodes 1 and 2 of this season, where we were talking about Frantz Fanon's book, a big part of the reading that we covered centered on how mistrust and our own self-limiting beliefs about our abilities as a people cause us to sabotage ourselves and others in this struggle for progress. And it's just a small example here that even back then, in the case of Sally Bassett fighting against something that was obviously very wrong and oppressive, there were still other Black people who did not believe or did not support the actions taken to challenge the status quo. And it resulted in a scenario where you had a visionary leader or revolutionary like Sally Bassett, her demise being as a result of some of our very own people ratting her out. And I think that ties in to some of our readings in this season because it's just a reminder of Frantz Fanon's book and that psychological impact, because even throughout back then very egregious examples of oppression, there was still this undermining, this self-sabotage that took place by our own people because of that long history of internal mistrust and its consequences. But on the bright side, as you just mentioned, her legacy sparked numerous uprisings across the Caribbean, which evidenced sort of that impact and that continued fire of resistance.
And that's the resistance that helps us to get into the step 2, right? To find the new. Because when you have individuals that are there to challenge and question the old and are going to take bold action in order to do that and to point out injustices and inequalities, it allows for that hope and that fire to lead into defining your new, figuring out what does work, what doesn't work. And that's where we get back into our unions and specifically Dr. E.F. Gordon and political modernization, right?
Yeah, and I mean, even people like, of course, Paulu Camargo-Fego, who this book club is named after, and the struggle for universal adult suffrage was an example of questioning the old and defining the new. Kido Swan outlines in his book how figures like, whether that's E.F. Gordon or Paulu Camargo-Fego, challenged the oligarchs and that rule of the 40 thieves. Historically, Bermuda did not have the free and fair equal franchise, meaning that persons got extra votes and could only vote if they had property. And that excluded the Black population to a large extent. And so that, that change where we now all have the right to vote is not something that just naturally came. It's something that came as a result of our leaders of the past and our people unifying and questioning that old. Who would have thought that the system, the entire political system, could change to accommodate a new class of voters, right? Back then, that was a crazy, controversial idea. And the only reason that it has changed is because we had a community and a people and a leadership who was willing to question and challenge the old values, the old leadership. Even if you go beyond just on the Black side, the Black and property-less right to vote, if you look at the bigger picture of Bermuda, right, a structure and a country where old white man or wealthy white man ruled, that was the natural order. right? Anything else was unquestionable. You know, how dare black Bermudians and black people in this British colony set up to extract wealth? How dare we think that we could govern the country? How dare we think we could have a voice in the leadership? And this is not something that's 300 and 400 years old. We're talking about a 50, 60, 70-year-old idea. An idea just as old as our parents and grandparents. And so even that radical shift of who could lead this country and run this island is something that came as a result of our people questioning and challenging the old, not just values, systems, and structures, but also the people in power.
And last week, I didn't mention the teachers union, and I want to be able to call their names this week. So, I reiterated that, or I told the audience that the teachers union formed at the gravesite of one of the teachers that had died. I think it was around like 3 teachers that had died in a short span of the month, just because of how overworked and how little resources that black teachers, especially black teachers, had back in the day. So it was Reverend Rufus Stubble, Miss Adeline Tucker, Miss Edith, and Miss Matilda Crawford in 1919 stood at the St. John's Church graveyard at the burial of one of their close friends, Miss Rosa Butterfield. And right there at the gravesite, they made plans to form the teachers' unions, because they would have like 100 students with 2 teachers in a classroom, and with teachers being, like I said, so overworked. Many of them had like died, passed away, sickness, stress. And so, yeah, right, it's like, how dare, you know, the idea that we have this system, it's not working, and through collective effort, just through the will for things to change, to want to see change, you had Bermudians who came together, who formed, sometimes right there in the midst of the mess, say, we're not going to do this anymore. Something needs to be done. We know what it is that we need. We have the ability to be able to do something and make change for it.
And before we even move on to step 2 about defining the new, right? We have to recognize just how serious and how powerful it is for us to even challenge and question the old, right? Because for that, you know, teachers union and other organizations to form, there had to be a level of hope amidst the despair, right? Like, if you use that very, you know, extreme example of at the gravesite of fallen or oppressed Bermudians, black Bermudians, teachers, workers, to find that hope to even challenge and say, why is this way? Can it be different? Why does it have to be like this? Does it have to be like this? It takes a lot to even get to that step, because there are so many people, even in today's Bermuda, as powerful as we are, that kind of have an attitude of like, this is the way it is, this is the way it was, and this is always the way that it will be. And that is only the case if you believe that, because as you just gave the example of, we have been through worse, we've been through more extreme, and we've been able to still imagine and question a different reality, right? And that is just so important in the process of political modernization, because that first step is just about daring to challenge and question. Once that's done, that's when we can look to step 2 in the process, which is defining and visualizing the new, right? Which is, now that we have decided we're not going to accept this current reality anymore, how do we go about potentially visualizing or imagining a different one? And that's where we'll get into some more of these examples that we can draw from Keto Swan's book. So, you know, one example, as you mentioned, Sam, is Dr. E.F. Gordon with Political Modernization and the Bermuda Workers Association. That was founded in 1944, and it paved the way for the change that went beyond just improve working conditions for Bermudian workers. That later turned into the Bermuda Industrial Union, which was the vehicle through which Dr. E.F. Gordon was able to use his leadership ability to get legal recognition for unions, which are powerhouses historically of Black Bermuda, right? As well as laying for the groundwork for the political transformation of Bermuda that came after Dr. E.F. Gordon's death in 1955.
And one of my favorite, I guess, lay quotes that I heard growing up when I heard stories and when I was taught about E.F. Gordon is that, you know, Americans had Garvey, they had Martin Luther King, and Bermudians had E.F. Gordon. And that just speaks to how big of a man, a giant of a man he was for the Black working Bermudian class, and his impact on not just forming the unions, but again, right, kind of giving that hope that things don't have to be the way they are. They don't have to stay this way. We have the power to be able to band together and to fight. And so his groundwork that he laid for the unions, the way in which he was able to lead in forming these various organizations, it goes back to what we were talking about with Frantz Fanon's book, that level of trust. Because this wasn't necessarily a Bermudian man born and bred in the streets of Bermuda, but when he came here and he brought his family and he, you know, looked around and realized that, you know, these working conditions that we have, the way we're being treated is not right. There is something we can do about it. And having that hope, like you said, right, in the midst of all the despair, what's it going to kind of take for us to get back to that is a question we need to ask ourselves. And again, building up the trust within the community. One thing that we did touch on in the last episode is that a lot of times it just doesn't feel that our leaders are hurt in the trenches with us. It doesn't feel like our leaders understand or are trying to understand a lot of the struggles that the average labor median is going through. And I don't think that's always the case. But if you're not proving that resilience, if you're not proving that we are all here trying to build these things together, whatever movement comes out of, you know, Roose's book club, future leaders, Bermuda is love, that's the real kind of like foundational work that we have to keep in mind as we build together, as we try to, you know, aim towards building a better Bermuda, as we have all these discussions about nation building. The bottom line and the groundwork needs to be that community trust. And that's what E.F. Gordon had with the people.
Well, you know, Simbrit, you talk about leadership and the disconnect, right? And you've been very critical of the leadership. In the past episode, you talked about how, you know, they don't command that same power that they did. And it seems like a lot of leaders are there by default, right? And placeholders. But you know what we don't talk about when we talk about leadership of the past versus today? And it's really interesting that we seem to ignore this fact. Do you know how old Dr. E.F. Gordon was when he became a doctor and came to Bermuda?
I had a light bulb moment. I do not remember off the top of my head, but he was young, wasn't he?
He was 23 years old when he qualified as a doctor.
That's crazy.
And he was younger than 30 when he came to Bermuda and started his activist work. And it was only within the next 15 years after that the Bermuda Workers Association was formed, right? So it bothers me when we see, even in National Heroes Day, pictures of our, you know, Barbara Ball, E.F. Gordon, and they were like old, you know, like the old in the pictures. They were not old when they did the work that they did. We took their picture and portrait when they were on their deathbeds and then said, these are our heroes. But they were totally different people by the time that they would have reached those ages from when they were really doing the work that we're actually recognizing them for. Dr. E.F. Gordon was less than the age of 30 when he began his work and his speeches and encouraging and empowering Bermudians to stand up for themselves. Dr. Barbara Ball was doing jujitsu on, the police, down at the riots. She wasn't a senior when she was doing that. You know what I mean? Paulu Kamaraka-Fego was traveling the world and was an MP between his 20s and 30s, right? So when we talk about leadership and that missing piece, I think what we conveniently ignore is we aged our leaders and heroes as the people of that time aged.
Yes,
but we didn't recognize that movement and that spark is ever youthful, right? So there's a time when you become of a certain age when that youthful naivety and energy needed, it passes, it goes away. And you have to look to the next generation now to find that next crop of visionary leadership. And I think we miss that in the conversation around building the new, because we seem to want to build new with old, and you can't.
No, you can't. And it's so interesting, Rai, because that reminds me that for the theater boycott, they were also young Bermudians within their 20s and early 30s, because a lot of them were just coming back from college and hadn't been a part of a lot of these student groups in the States and in Canada. They came back with a vigorance and with a passion and an energy to be able to make and create change in Bermuda. So that I've never really kept that in the forefront of my mind. So thank you, Rai. But it does remind me that almost all of these movements that we look at in Bermuda, they were started by young people.
And
they were young, they were teenagers, they were fresh from college, they were just getting into their professions. And like you said, that energy, it does take a young energy to be able to push forwards, because we're talking about being able to hope in the midst of hopelessness, being able to look around you and say, we have to do something. We have to do something about where we are in this day and age. And we know that, ironically, in Bermuda, we have a hard time letting young Bermudians come into a organization, a profession, a space, and saying, hey, we need to make some changes. This isn't sustainable. And even within our own communities, we have the elders, we have older people who are really resistant to that change and really resistant in allowing young Bermudians to be able to kind of take up arms and take on the mantle.
Because somewhere along the way, we looked at the portraits of our national heroes and we looked at the murals on the wall and we saw seniors and older faces and concluded that we have to show deference to them in charting forward the future, not recognizing that those persons who we appreciate and acknowledge in the old age were once young and vibrant and active in pushing the envelope. As you were talking, Sam, I was just looking at the cover image of Keto's book, Black Power in Bermuda. And on the cover of the book is 3 young Black Bermudian men holding a sign that says, "Free the Panthers." You mentioned that a lot of these young figures and visionaries, whether it's Dr. E.F. Gordon, Paulu Kamaraka-Fego, these are students who went off to university. They built networks with other bright, young Black people from around the world, and they all came back to their respective home countries and challenged the status quo and were able to build connection with each other and build community. On the cover of Black Power in Bermuda are Black berets with the Free Panther sign, Jerome Parent-Chief, my uncle, who's still alive and young and vibrant, Ben Aaron, and Cal Shabazz. And I'm just reading those names because as we get further into this book, whether it's Paulu, whether it's Barbara Ball, whether it's E.F. Gordon, even in the pictures, and when I share whether that's historical figures and revolutionaries, even on, for example, my personal social media page, you will always, where possible, see them at the young age when they committed the things that we know them for, because other young Bermudians and even the seniors need to be reminded and see that actually the youth are not just the future, but they are also the here and now. And historically, they are the movers and shakers. And if we lose that, if we feel like they need to, as you said in the last episode, stay in their place, well, this is their place. Their place is moving the place and changing and pushing the envelope. And that's just a crucial side note. I know I veered a little bit from the conversation and the script today, but it's a thought that came about when you were talking about leadership, because this is a crucial piece of defining the new. It's not just defining it in a book or in writing or in a forum. It's actually about defining the new generation as well, and what they represent and supporting them. So let's take a break. And when we come back, we're going to continue with some more examples of the ways in which step 2, defining the new, have manifested historically in Bermuda, as demonstrated by Keto Swan's book, Black Power in Bermuda. And we'll continue and see how many other examples we can draw out today for today's episode, all about On Our Own Terms. Roose's Book Club is presented to you by Future Leaders Bermuda, registered charity number 1009. The views expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect the views of our organization or any of us in our professional capacities. However, the content of all discussions is rooted in carefully curated learning material, and in that sense, not everything expressed is merely an opinion, but a reflection of our research and the aims and objectives of our organization as a whole. In all our activities at Future Leaders, we encourage independent thought with a community-centered and social justice-minded approach that enables listeners to gain a better understanding of themselves, disrupt the status quo, and take charge over their futures. We ask you to listen with this in mind.
Welcome back, listeners. You are tuned in to Roose's Book Club, and we are on episode 4 of season 2, Perception and Reality. And today's episode is entitled On Our Own Terms. We finished the break on step number 2 of political modernization from Kwame Ture and Charles V. Hamilton's book, The Black Power, The Politics of Liberation. And we are taking a lot of his concepts and not just Bermudianizing them, but really pulling out examples of how we've already followed these principles and these steps in our past. So we finished talking about Dr. E.F. Gordon and his role in forming a lot of the unions today. So the BIU most famously, but also the Bermuda Workers Association. And we're going to continue to delve into examples of our history. We're also using Keto Swan's book, The Black Power in Bermuda, The Struggle for Decolonization. And we're about to hop into the 1969 Black Power Conference that took place here on Island. And not just what the conference entailed and all the details of it, but the impact that it had on some of the political grassroots in Bermuda and its wider influence across the diaspora. And it's pretty exciting to read about this. Like, I had no idea this had happened. And reading about this in Keto's book was, it was a really indescribable feeling, because not only was this a big, big, big deal, but it just also reminded me of how much we have lost between in this short time, because you're talking about the 60s and the 70s.
2 generations.
That's one generation. That's my parents. My parents grew up in this era of Bermuda. Like, my parents were born amongst this era in Bermuda. And so we're talking about like a generation ago, and this information has been lost. And so I can't wait for us to really delve into this. Yeah,
and unfortunately we won't be able to go through the entire details of the conference today, but that's why we have a season 3 coming, and another episode still to go in this season. But the point of today's episode is really showing that when we look at the modernization process outlined in Kwame Ture and Charles V. Hamilton's book, these steps of questioning the old, defining the new, and pursuing economic and political self-determination have actually been done before right here in Bermuda. So it's not just some foreign aspiration. It's actually something that our forefathers were able to achieve. And that's how we got the progress that we did make in terms of our black organizations, our unions, our sports and community clubs, our political parties, equal rights in terms of legislation. And so, yeah, Sam, I mean, getting into examples like the 1969 Black Power Conference are really important. And Keto Swan talks a lot about this in chapter 4, particularly around pages 77 to 94 in his book, Black Power in Bermuda, The Struggle for Decolonization, because the Black Power Conference was organized by young people and young intellectuals such as Paulu Kamaraka-Fego, who this book club is named after, as well as it resulted in some of the impacts of that conference. It wasn't just a talk shop, but out of this conference came groups like the Black Beret Cadre. The conference, believe it or not, was actually sponsored by the youth wing of the Progressive Labor Party. And so, like what you were talking about before the break, tying into that youth element, this is actually like we were building not just movements, we were having conferences, we were building organizations and actually making change and having it result in change. And at that Black Power Conference, which saw guests from around the world, the attendees were able to create a vision for Bermudian liberation that was rooted in Black unity, in Pan-Africanism. They had different segments of the conference. They talked about the economy. They talked about education reform. They directly challenged some of the curriculums that existed, the cultural erasure. Some of the panel topics included what is Black power and what is Black education, all around defining the new, which is that step 2 in the political modernization process we talk about. There's a quote here that says, the Black Power Conference sought to build a united front of African-descended Bermudians, define a Bermudian Black Power ideology, and develop a strategic plan of action for revolution. And as we saw from that conference in 1969, what types of events did we have after that that can be actually directly attributed to this mobilization and this modernization that young people of that time were playing out?
And again, that interconnectedness of the different groups that came together to put this all on the forefront of like Bermuda and Bermuda society, because the opening ceremony was held at PHC. The workshops were across the island at Vernon Temple, at Francis Patton, the Bishop Spencer Schools, Alaska Hall, Devonshire Recreational Club, PHC, Hamilton Workmen's Club, and the closing ceremony was held at the RAC. So, it's so interesting, Rob, because these are some of the names that we called out in last episode when it came to the leadership. And so it's so
how far we have
fallen. And again, this is a critique of not just to get on her and point fingers. This is a genuine examination of where we've been, where we are now, the disconnect, because we have to be able to get back her in order to move forward in building Bermuda back up and building back up our communities and moving towards nation building and self-determination. It's more than just about getting on her and gossiping. We're not here to stir trouble or to ruffle feathers in a way that is just for the sake of it. This is having a genuine analysis of how is it that we went from being able to put on a Black conference. And just so our listeners know, we had speakers from Ethiopia, Tanzania, New York, St. Kitts that headed the workshops. And these were alongside other local Bermudians. You had people present like Dr. Marjorie Bean, Dr. F.S. Frabbit, who was the principal at the Berkeley Institute at the time, Dr. Eva Hodgson, Bishop Bright, and MP Hugh Richardson gave speeches in the opening ceremony. Dr. Kamara Kafego was the chairperson for this entire conference. It really drew in a lot of global attention because this was actually the first Black Power conference that was held within the Caribbean. They had never had a Black conference before. And the point of this conference, like you said, Roy, It was to be able to form and to sort of strategize and localize what and define what Black power would look like in Bermuda, specifically to be able to challenge anti-colonialism. And the reason why it was even held in Bermuda is because we were one of the last strong colonial powerhouses within the Caribbean and North American region. And to be honest, we still are today, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is several news outlets wanted to be at the event as well. But Keto says in his book that it was considered Black people's business, and they were pressured to stay away. And they were pressured to stay away specifically by intelligence agencies.
Mm-hmm. Well, the conference itself, it was closed to outside international media because Black people and those who attended wanted to make sure that we could really focus on action.
Yes.
But what I think you're speaking to, Sam, is the attention that the power of this Black Power conference drew, right? It was shadowed the entire time by the British military. Mm-hmm. There were Marines present on the ground. The Navy was docked in Bermuda's harbor. And organizations like the CIA noted concerns that grew out of this conference. There were people, Marcus Garvey and others, who were blocked from coming to Bermuda around this time period in Bermuda's history, because this conference officially launched the Black Power movement across the Caribbean. And that's spoken to in page 90 of Keto's book in terms of the power and the impact that the organization had. So this wasn't just our best and brightest local figures, but it was also a demonstration of the power of our local leadership and the connectedness that they had to the global movement, which, as you mentioned, it really wasn't that long ago. And that's the craziest part about this. When we were on the break, we have Miles here in the studio who's doing our recording, who just had mentioned that when we were talking about the young leaders that we had and why we don't know or talk about this, she says, I wonder if it's deliberate that we portray the leadership and our visionary leaders as older people, as not being young. Like, I wonder if that's a deliberate attempt to really kind of disconnect our young peers from that history and that power. Mm-hmm. And I'm inclined to agree with Mouse, because there has to be a reason why this was only a few decades ago, the era of our parents, Simbrit, and so many of us don't even know about these types of things. You can't tell me that that's a coincidence. So that's what we're here to draw out today. There's so much more in Keto Swan's book, and we're going to get into it. That's why, as we mentioned, this is a journey. There are more pieces to uncover in the educational curriculum of Roose's book club. But today, what we're really trying to hone in on is those 3 steps of political modernization, of challenging the old, defining the new, and we're going to shift into that last part to wrap up, self-determination and action, just to talk a little bit more about the culmination of these steps. We may also have time for a call or two. We'll go a couple minutes over our normal time today. 297-1075 if you want to get in on the conversation.
And as we move into step 3, we really were able to dive into a lot of the political action in reading Black Power in Bermuda. As you talk about the deliberate disconnect and the deliberate sort of like hiding of Bermuda's history, and with us not really being able to connect and know that it was young Bermudians heading this movement. One thing that really stood out to me, even as we were writing the script, right, is that the Black Beret cadre was actually formed as a result of this Black Power conference. And they attempted to implement a lot of the resolutions and the ideas that came about for the conference. And it's so interesting because I didn't know about the Black Berets growing up, but I was always under the impression that they were sort of like copycatting the Black Panther movement. And to know that it was not necessarily direct influence of the Black Panther movement, it was direct influence of the Black Power conference that was held right here in Bermudians, put on by Bermudians, and then Bermudians left this and decided to action it within their own young youth group. This is just subtle ways in which our history is sort of like distorted so that we're not as inspired to be able to take up that mantle and pass it on. And I will agree with you, Rai. To me, that it can't be a coincidence.
And, it's all an attempt to make us feel isolated, alone, disconnected, and disempowered, right? When we go to page 77, as you just spoke to, the Black Parade Cadre was formed in the aftermath of this conference in an attempt to implement many of the resolutions put forward. And they did succeed in many of the things put forward. So if we go to page 95 in Keto Swan's book in chapter 5, he talks about how the Black Berets and other groups developed autonomous strategies, including youth education, healthcare services, political education. They offered alternatives to the colonial government. They created free breakfast and food programs. They had community health clinics, and they had liberation schools where they taught some of these things to young people. And many of our parents and their peers will say they went to liberation schools and they spent their weekends learning this type of stuff. They were writing letters to activists in prison at a young age. And the model of self-determination, according to Black Power in Bermuda on page 106, was both local and revolutionary. And so these things had real effects through clinics, through food programs. He mentions on page 95, the cadre's model challenged traditional party politics by emphasizing mass education, economic cooperatives, and political consciousness as prerequisites for real liberation. So even with what we're talking about with Roose's book club, it's nothing new. It's an attempt to have a resurgence of some of the very strategies that have been demonstrated, outlined in these books, have been done before and can be done again. And that's why we're talking about today what we lost and why it matters.
And this is the action that happens as a result of that self-determination, as a result of doing steps 1 and 2. It leads you directly into action. And that's exactly, interesting enough, that is exactly how the PLP formed, right? It was a group of young Bermudians who knew that Black Bermudians were disenfranchised. And initially they started out wanting to focus on the issues that directly impacted Bermudians. Working Bermudians. So a focus was on jobs, a focus was on housing, on voting rights, right? On, like you said, electoral fairness. And so there are so many different examples. You had the uprisings and the upheaval with the Balka riots, with workers being able to protest and to go out into the streets, not necessarily just to be able to cause disruption, but to actually evoke change based on the needs that they already knew that they had, and were able to action those and itemize those things in real time. I mean, we've run out of time today, right, to really continue to get into all the points that we wanted to delve in for this episode. Good thing we do have one more episode coming up in the next 2 weeks, so we'll gladly continue this discussion. And Black Power Bermuda is definitely going to be a book that we're going to delve into as we head into next season as well. But like you said, right, it's ending on the note of really questioning why revival is necessary. As we've gone through these 3 points pretty thoroughly, today we just revealed that the past proves it's possible. It's absolutely possible to be able to dream in the midst of the chaos and in the midst of all the societal decay, right? Because we've already been here and we've already done the work of being able to question the old, define the new, and then put steps in place towards self-determination. And we've broken down that with the Black Conference, but there's so much more that we can get into. So I know that we have a caller, we have a listener who is tuned in and has been sending me messages about things we've missed and so forth. So I just want our listeners to know that we're not able to cover everything in the episode and not able to get in depth into everything that's in the book, but the point is that we've already had the foundations and the infrastructure put in place. We just have to go back and read.
Mm-hmm. And, we don't get the chance to go through everything, which is why we encourage listeners to read the books and engage with us online and through other forms, right? Mm-hmm. This is just to give a taste of some of the concepts that we want to introduce and encourage our Bermudian public to engage with, right? Talking about revival and why it's necessary, past proves possible, right? So from Paulu's Pan-Africanism to the cadre's systems and infrastructure, Bermuda's liberation movements embodied each step of political modernization as conceptualized by Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton in those 3 steps. The warning that Ture and Hamilton gave was that co-opted leaders dilute movements. And so revival must be rooted in clarity of purpose and community control. And Dr. Keto Swan himself and his framing, as outlined in the introduction when he talks about the myth of black criminality, and ironically, how criminalization was weaponized to destroy black power, where the state labeled self-determination as terrorism. But that self-determination, that community control was the very path toward independence. And I know that's something that Dr. Keto Swan believes in, as exemplified by his powerful work here, which allows us to even have the conversation in the first place. And so as we wrap up today's episode, we just want to encourage our listeners that this is not a one-off conversation. We appreciate that the caller, even though, we diverged a little bit, he did mention that he's in agreement with everything we've talked about today. And I know that a lot of the audience are truly engaging with the content and the points that we're making here. This is season 2, episode 4, On Our Own Terms. And as we mentioned at the start of this episode, this is an educational journey. We'll be engaging with Dr. Keto Swan's book some more. We may potentially have the opportunity to engage with him as well and some of the other authors of our local books, which would really be a joy and a blessing and an honor for us to be able to facilitate deeper conversations as we grow Roose's Book Club. But in the meantime, to the audience that are listening, if you're just tuning in for the first time today, or you've only caught part of this conversation, we encourage you to go to futureleaders.bm, click on Roose's Book Club. Alternatively, you can go to www.roosesbookclub.bm. Have a look at the past episodes, the past seasons. All of the books that we'll be using are outlined there. Today, we got into Black Power in Bermuda, The Struggle for Decolonization by the great Keto Swan. And for those of you that want to catch up before our final episode in 2 weeks from now, final episode of this season, go on our website and have a look at the YouTube channel. You can rewatch all of the previous episodes and catch up to speed. With that being said, we look forward to circling back in 2 weeks with our last episode for this season, season 2, Perception and Reality. It'll be our final episode for this particular phase of Roose's Book Club. We want to thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.